Rome, the city that had conquered the entire known world, the city that had crushed kings, burned armies, and brought entire civilizations to their knees. The greatest military machine ever built by human hands, a republic so powerful that its enemies wept before the first sword was drawn. And somewhere in southern Italy, on the sun-baked slopes of a sleeping volcano, 70 men are weaving ropes out of wild vines. Men, not kings, not generals, not even soldiers. And gladiators, their hands are rough from chains, their backs still carry the marks of whips. They have no plan, no country, no army. They have kitchen knives, they have hatred, and they have one thing Rome does not. Nothing left to lose. Within 3 years, those 70 men will grow into an army of over 100,000. Within 3 years, they will defeat 11 Roman armies. Within 3 years, they will make the senators of the most powerful city on earth barricade their doors and pray. And the man leading them will not be remembered as a conqueror, or a king, or an emperor. He will be remembered as something far more dangerous. A symbol. His name is Spartacus. And this is his story. Before we can understand who Spartacus was, we need to understand the world that made him. And that world had a very dark foundation. By the time Spartacus was born, around 111 BC, historians believe the Roman Republic was the most powerful nation on earth. It had conquered Greece. It had destroyed Carthage, its greatest rival, burning an entire civilization to the ground until nothing but ash remained. Roman armies had marched through Spain, North Africa, the Middle East. They brought home treasure, land, and power. And they brought home people. Millions of them. Every time Rome won a war, and Rome almost always won, the people it defeated were forced into slavery. An entire city might resist a Roman siege for months, fighting with everything they had. When the walls finally fell, the men were killed. The women and children were shackled and marched to the slave markets. This was not something Romans were ashamed of. It was simply how the world worked, in their view. Imagine this if you can. Imagine that after every soccer match your team won, you got to bring home the other team as your personal servants. They had to do whatever you said. They had no rights. They could not leave. And if they disobeyed, the law said you could punish them however you wanted. That is not quite the same, of course, but it gives you a tiny sense of how normal Romans saw slavery. It was simply a prize of winning. By the 1st century BC, an astonishing number of people living inside Roman territory, perhaps 1 in 5 or even more, were enslaved. In some parts of Sicily and southern Italy, slaves vastly outnumbered the free population. Rome's slave economy was so enormous that some historians estimate up to 2 to 3 million enslaved people were living in Roman Italy alone during the late Republic, in a total population of perhaps 6 million. Now, not all slavery in Rome looked the same. Some enslaved people worked as tutors, doctors, clerks, or household servants for wealthy families. If their owner was kind, their life was hard but survivable. A few could even save money and eventually buy their own freedom. But that was the lucky minority. For most, slavery was grinding, brutal labor that destroyed the body. The mines of Hispania, modern-day Spain, swallowed men whole. The vast grain farms of Sicily, called latifundia, needed armies of workers, and those workers were owned like tools. The hours were endless. The food was barely enough to stay alive. And under Roman law, a slave was not a person. A slave was property, no different legally from a chair or a donkey. An owner could beat their slave, could torture them under certain circumstances, could even kill them, and face no punishment at all. That was the world Spartacus was born into. Not as a slave yet, but living right on its edge. Now where exactly did this man come from? The honest answer is, we are not entirely sure. The ancient historians who wrote about Spartacus, men named Plutarch and Appian and Florus, wrote their accounts over 200 years after he lived. They had access to older records, but those records were incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and often colored by Roman bias. What they all agree on is this: Spartacus was Thracian. Thrace was a region to the north of Greece, covering parts of what we today call Bulgaria, northern Greece, and the European edge of Turkey. It sat on the frontier of the Mediterranean world, a land of rolling hills, dense forests, and fierce, independent-minded people. To the Romans, Thracians were what they called barbarians, meaning people outside of Roman or Greek civilization. But Plutarch, one of our best sources on Spartacus, wrote that the man was much more than one would expect from his condition, calling him most intelligent and cultured, being more like a Greek than a Thracian. That was Plutarch's version of the highest compliment he knew how to give. Spartacus likely grew up among a semi-nomadic Thracian people called the Maedi, pastoralists who moved with their flocks across the high Bulgarian countryside, tending sheep and cattle through freezing winters and blazing summers. Life as a shepherd in ancient Thrace was not the gentle image you might picture. These were wild borderlands. Wolves and bears hunted the flocks. Rival tribes raided each other's villages. Bandits lurked on the mountain roads. A shepherd needed to know how to fight. And so Spartacus learned. At some point, the sources are vague here, and we should be honest with you about that. Spartacus became a soldier. He may have fought for Rome as an auxiliary soldier, meaning a non-Roman fighter who served alongside the legions in exchange for pay. Auxiliaries were common. Rome used them constantly, drawing warriors from conquered or allied territories to fill out its armies. Some historians believe this is how Spartacus came to understand Roman military tactics so deeply, a knowledge that would, years later, allow him to defeat those very same tactics on the battlefield. But at some point things went wrong. The sources offer different explanations: desertion, theft, leading unauthorized raids. Perhaps he simply refused an order. Perhaps he tried to escape. Whatever the reason, Spartacus was captured, and the Romans sold him into slavery. He had a wife with him when he was caught. Plutarch tells us she was a prophetess, a kind of holy woman from his own Thracian people. The Romans had a story about her, one they may have invented later to add drama to the tale, but it is a good enough story to tell. When Spartacus was first brought to Rome to be sold, she saw a snake coiled around his face while he slept. She took it as a prophecy. This man, she said, would be wrapped in a great and terrible power. It would bring him glory, and it would bring him to ruin. She could not see which would come first. She was right about both. He was a man of intelligence and strength, stripped of his freedom and his name, now walking in chains toward the last place on earth that Rome sent its most dangerous captives. Gladiator School. Let's talk about gladiators for a moment, because Hollywood has given you some great images and some very wrong ideas. The gladiators were not simply criminals thrown to lions and forced to fight to the death every week. The reality was both more complicated and, in some ways, even more fascinating. Gladiators were trained athletes, specialist stars. The word gladiator comes from gladius, the short stabbing sword that many of them used. These fighters performed in massive stone arenas called amphitheaters before crowds of thousands. The Roman games, called the ludi, were enormously popular entertainment. Powerful politicians and generals paid for the shows to win votes and popularity. The more spectacular the performance, the bigger the crowd, the more political points you earned. Think of gladiators like a mix between professional wrestlers, MMA fighters, and rock stars. They trained for years. They had fans. They had managers. Their fights were often theatrical as much as deadly, crowd pleasers designed to build tension before a dramatic finish. Some gladiators became so famous they had their names scratched onto walls all over the empire, the way modern fans might write on social media about their favorite athlete. But here is the part Hollywood usually gets right. Many fights did end in death, and behind the fame and the spectacle, every gladiator was in most cases enslaved. Gladiators actually ate a special high-carbohydrate diet, heavy in grains and legumes, to build up a thick layer of body fat. This sounds strange, but it was strategic. The extra fat protected their organs from shallow cuts in the arena without slowing them down much. The gladiators lived and trained in facilities called ludi, gladiatorial schools. These were essentially walled compounds, part dormitory, part military training ground, part prison. The living conditions were actually better than what most slaves experienced elsewhere. Gladiators were valuable property. You needed to keep them healthy and strong. But there were walls, and guards, and the knowledge that your owner could send you into the arena at any time. Spartacus was taken to the Ludus in Capua, a major city in the Campania region, about 170 miles south of Rome. The school was owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, a wealthy Roman with political connections and a business to run. Batiatus was what Romans called a lanista, a trainer and manager of gladiators. He bought promising fighters, trained them into weapons, and sent them into the arena to earn money and fame. When Batiatus looked at the Thracians standing in his courtyard, he saw potential. Strong, intelligent, experienced fighter, already knew how armies moved. Spartacus was assigned to fight as a type of gladiator called a gallus, a heavy fighter who carried a large oblong shield and a sword. Later historical tradition sometimes records him as a myrmilo, another similar heavily armed type. Whatever the specific category, he was built for power and endurance. Now picture what life was like inside that school. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, the gladiators were roused and put to work. Training was brutal and methodical. Hours with the wooden practice sword, hours running and lifting, combat drills, footwork, learning how to use a shield, not just to block, but to attack. Hours more studying the weaknesses of different fighter types, because in the arena you might face someone with a completely different weapon and style. The gladiators who survived long enough became extraordinary fighters. Years of daily training against other expert combatants produced warriors of incredible skill and physical conditioning. Spartacus trained, he watched, he thought, and he began to notice something. The school held hundreds of men, all enslaved, all forced into an existence they had not chosen. Most of them felt, every single day, the deep burning humiliation of being owned by another human being. And Spartacus started talking to them. Not loudly, not at first. He was too smart for that. He spoke quietly at night, in the spaces between the guards' rounds. He asked questions. He listened. He built trust. He wanted to know who was ready to fight, not in the arena for Roman crowds, but for themselves. What he found surprised even him. The men were ready, not just some of them. Almost all of them. 200 gladiators had agreed to the plan. The escape was set for a night in 73 BC, and then, just hours before they were supposed to move, someone talked. Imagine the moment when you've planned everything, and the plan falls apart. That is what happened to Spartacus in the spring of 73 BC. The escape was supposed to involve roughly 200 gladiators breaking out of the school together, but somehow, through an informant, a slip of the tongue, an overheard conversation, Batiatus's guards discovered the plot. The planned escape collapsed. Most of the men were caught before they could move, but about 70, Spartacus among them, managed to break free anyway. They grabbed whatever they could find in the kitchen on their way out. Cleavers, skewers, butcher's knives, not exactly the weapons of a conquering army. Then fortune gave them their first gift. On the road out of Capua, they came across wagons loaded with gladiatorial weapons and armor being transported to another city. The small band fell on the wagons, armed themselves properly, and vanished into the countryside. 70 men, fugitive slaves in the most powerful country on earth. So what do? You go somewhere defensible. Spartacus led the group toward a mountain, not just any mountain, one of the most famous mountains in history, Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius is the same volcano that, roughly 150 years later, would erupt and bury the Roman city of Pompeii in ash and rock, killing thousands in a single morning. In Spartacus's time, it had not erupted for hundreds of years, and its slopes were covered with thick forests and wild grapevines. No one considered it dangerous. That was about to change, though not from lava. Vesuvius offered everything a small, desperate group needed. High ground, thick vegetation for cover, multiple escape routes through the forests, and a commanding view of the plains below, so they could see any approaching army long before it arrived. From this position, the gladiators began to recruit. News of the escape spread across the countryside like wildfire, and it found ready ears. Southern Italy was filled with enslaved people, working the vast grain farms, the vineyards, the olive orchards of wealthy Roman landowners. Their lives were exhausting and brutal. When they heard that a small band of gladiators had broken free and was holding their own against Rome, something awakened in them. People started slipping away from the farms in the night and walking toward Vesuvius. Within weeks, Spartacus's group had swelled to several thousand. The gladiators were the hard core, the trained fighters, the specialists. But these new arrivals brought something just as valuable: numbers, local knowledge, and a fury that had been building for years. Spartacus organized them, drilled them. He knew from his time as a soldier that an untrained mob was not an army. An army required structure, coordination, and discipline. He began building one. 3 commanders emerged to lead this growing force. Spartacus himself, a Gaul named Crixus, fiery and aggressive, who had also been enslaved and trained as a gladiator, and another Gaul named Ennomos, about whom we know less, but who was clearly respected. Meanwhile, Rome noticed the escaped slaves. But here is the thing, and it tells you everything you need to know about how Roman elites thought about enslaved people. Rome was not scared. Not even a little. The Senate had bigger problems. Over in Spain, a renegade Roman general named Sertorius was causing trouble. In the east, Rome was fighting a long war against the kingdom of Pontus, led by a brilliant king named Mithridates. The legions were stretched across the world. And anyway, these were slaves, kitchen workers and farm laborers, a handful of escaped gladiators hiding on a volcano. The Senate assigned a praetor, a mid-ranking official, not even a top-level military commander, named Gaius Claudius Glaber, to deal with it. Glaber did not bother assembling professional Roman soldiers. He scraped together about 3,000 militiamen, local armed men with minimal training, and marched them to the base of Vesuvius. Then Glaber did what he thought was the obvious, easy solution. He blocked the only known road up the mountain, and waited for them to starve. It was a sensible plan, simple, no risk to his own men, just wait. Glaber had never heard the phrase that every military commander should know. Never underestimate a desperate, intelligent man with nothing left to lose. Spartacus looked at the situation and thought. Glaber was covering the road, but Glaber was only looking at the road. He thought the steep cliffs on all other sides of Vesuvius were impassable. Spartacus looked at the cliffs. Then he looked at the wild grapevines climbing all over the mountain slopes. He told his men to start making ropes. Hundreds of vines, twisted and braided together, long enough to reach the base of the cliff on the sides. Glaber's men weren't watching. Then, one by one, in the middle of the night, the gladiators and their recruits rappelled down the cliff face in the darkness. They made it to the bottom undetected. They circled around the sleeping Roman camp, and at dawn they attacked from completely the wrong direction. The militiamen woke up to chaos, gladiators coming at them from where there was supposed to be nothing but cliff. Glaber's 3,000 men, most of them unprepared and half awake, broke and ran. Glaber himself. The Roman records simply stopped mentioning him after this. He may have died in the rout, or he may have escaped and was too embarrassed to ever appear in the public record again. Either way, the Battle of Mount Vesuvius was over in minutes, and Spartacus had his first victory. His men stripped the dead Romans of their weapons and armor. Every soldier who'd fled had left behind a sword, a shield, a helmet. The gladiator army was now equipped with real Roman military gear. Word spread even faster now. More slaves came, former soldiers who had been enslaved, peasant farmers who had lost everything to wealthy landowners, herders, craftsmen, people who had been grinding their teeth under Roman power for years, and now saw a chance, maybe the only chance they would ever have. By the end of 73 BC, Spartacus commanded an army of 40,000. But Rome was no longer laughing, and the next army coming was not going to be militiamen.